Hey everyone! Welcome to the second lesson on HTTP requests. In the previous lesson, you have learned the fundamentals of HTTP requests. In this lesson, you will learn what APIs are and how you can use their endpoints to retrieve useful data inside your Integromat scenarios. First, let's look at a simple definition of what an API is. API stands for Application Programming Interface and traditionally was a way for code components inside a software to connect and interact together privately. However, APIs can also be configured to be publicly accessible, and this is something that has become very popular with the rise of networking. As the definition suggests, a public API can be easily accessed by anyone and can be used in countless ways to create powerful scenarios. A simple way to think about it is this. A program or workflow that you create is able to utilize the functionality of other programs with just a simple connection to their APIs. Isn't that cool? The best example of a tool that uses thousands of APIs is, of course, Integromat. With Integromat, even though you don't get to see the complex code behind each application integration, the principles are the same. All connections are made through the available APIs of each application. Now, you might be wondering, what role does the HTTP app play in this discussion? Well, even though Integromat allows you to very easily integrate thousands of APIs together, there are still millions of public APIs out there that we have not yet discovered, and you might want to integrate with your workflow. The HTTP app is what you need in order to make these integrations possible. As mentioned in the last video, all web services can be accessed using HTTP requests. And that's exactly what a public API is, a web service. So now let's take a look at an example of a public API. randomuser.me. This is a website with a public API which allows you to generate random fake user data which you can use for testing purposes. One thing to note is that a company or software that has a publicly accessible API will always include documentation for it. Otherwise, you will not know how to connect to it. As you can see, randomuser.me has a documentation page which explains how you can interact with their API. API documentation can be simple and easy to understand when you know the fundamentals of HTTP requests, which we covered in the last video. So let's take a look at this documentation. As you can see, each section explains a different use case of the API, and at the end, there's always a URL. As you might have already noticed, each one of these URLs is the same, however, they all end differently. These combinations of parameters are referred to as API endpoints. An endpoint is what allows you to customize your request to a particular API in order to achieve a specific result or retrieve specific data. A simple way to think about it is like searching for a particular term on Google. You are making a request to google.com, but you are passing specific search parameters to your request, which will allow Google to generate relevant search results. As you can see on the documentation of this API, the parameter results equals 5,000 is used to generate up to 5,000 random users from a single request. The parameter gender equals female is used to generate a random female user. Now let's take a look at a more complex and useful API, newsapi.org. This is an API that allows you to retrieve the latest news headlines from all over the world. As you can see, the major difference between this API is that it requires authentication. This is true by the fact that an API key needs to be attached as a parameter to each one of your requests, as you can see here. News API offers a free API key for developers that can be attained by creating an account on their website. However, it is important to note that some of the services you might choose to use the APIs of in the future might require you to pay a monthly fee in order to obtain a key. Looking at the examples of the API requests you can make, as you can see, the HTTP request method is clearly stated. You can also clearly see the different parameters that needed to be added to your request URL in order to retrieve specific information. In this case, the top business headlines in the US right now. So, to recap, there are many publicly available APIs that you can use in order to add a particular functionality to your Integromat workflow or retrieve useful data in your scenarios. APIs will most often include a documentation page which clearly demonstrates how to call the API and perform requests. API endpoints let you customize your requests with parameters in order to call a specific resource or retrieve specific data. Some APIs will require authentication with every request you make. This is usually done by passing an API key as a parameter to your request. And this concludes our lesson on APIs and API endpoints. In the next lesson, you will learn how to make a GET request to an API inside Integromat and how to use the data retrieved in your scenarios. See you there.